After 30 years investigating violent crimes, I thought I'd seen everything. Then Sarah Miller's case landed on my desk. 4 teenage girls, her best friends, dug a grave and planned her murder. They tortured her for hours, stabbed her through the shoulder, and buried her alive while filming it. Somehow, with hands tied and a knife through her body, she escaped. The video went viral. 7 years later, something happened that nobody expected. Subscribe to this channel, because understanding how predators disguise themselves as friends could save your life or someone you love. Some cases stay with you long after the files are closed, long after the interviews are done, long after you think you've seen everything this world has to offer. After 30 years of investigating the darkest corners of human nature, I thought I'd witnessed every possible variation of cruelty, every shade of betrayal. But then Sarah Miller's case landed on my desk, and I realized there were still depths of human darkness I hadn't yet explored. September 29th, 2016. The date burns in my memory like a brand. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Thursday in Trinity Falls, a sleepy town nestled in the rolling hills of rural Georgia, where nothing more exciting than a stolen bicycle or underage drinking typically crossed the police blotter. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where front doors stay unlocked, and where the worst thing that happens is someone's dog getting into their neighbor's trash. Trinity Falls was the embodiment of small-town America, with its population of barely 8,000 souls living in blissful ignorance of the evil that was about to unfold in their midst. Sarah Miller was 14 years old that September, a bright-eyed girl on the cusp of her 15th birthday, her head full of dreams about the party her parents had promised her. She was the kind of teenager who still believed in the fundamental goodness of people, who trusted easily and loved fiercely. Her world was painted in the innocent pastels of adolescence, sleepovers with friends, school gossip, and the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere. She had no way of knowing that her trust would soon become a weapon used against her, that her loyalty would be the very thing that nearly destroyed her. In Trinity Falls, Sarah lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a modest subdivision on the outskirts of town where the houses were small, but the yards were generous, where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and the sound of laughter echoed through the streets on summer evenings. It was the kind of neighborhood where mothers called to each other across fence lines, where fathers gathered around grills on weekends, where everyone knew which house had the best Halloween decorations. Sarah's family had moved there when she was 12, seeking the safety and community that small towns promised. The Miller house sat at the end of Maple Street, a pale yellow ranch with white shutters and a garden that Sarah's mother tended with religious devotion. Sarah shared this home with her parents and her 4-year-old sister Emma, a little girl with special needs who required constant care and supervision. Emma was Sarah's shadow, following her everywhere with the unquestioning adoration that only a younger sibling can possess. Sarah had embraced her role as big sister with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood that some people in this world needed extra looking after. Sarah's days followed a rhythm that seemed as eternal as the seasons. School in the morning, where she was a solid B student who got along with everyone, but wasn't part of any particular clique. Afternoons were for Emma, therapy appointments, doctor visits, or simply playing in the backyard while their mother worked her second job at the local diner. Evenings were for homework, family dinner, and the teenage ritual of texting friends and planning weekend activities. It was a simple life, perhaps even mundane by some standards, but it was Sarah's life, and she cherished every ordinary moment of it. What made Sarah's world complete were her friendships, particularly with 2 girls who lived just 1 street over in the same subdivision. Madison Torres and Jessica Chen had become Sarah's closest companions since the Miller family's arrival in Trinity Falls. The 3 girls were inseparable, spending countless hours in each other's homes, sharing secrets, dreams, and the intense emotional bonds that teenage girls forge with the intensity of plasma welders. Madison lived in a blue house with a wraparound porch, where her grandmother's wind chimes created a constant symphony in the breeze. She was the leader of their little trio, the one who made the plans and set the agenda for their adventures. Madison had the kind of confidence that comes naturally to some teenagers, an easy way of commanding attention and making others want to follow her lead. She was pretty in the way that small-town girls often are, not magazine beautiful, but attractive enough to turn heads at the local pizza place where teenagers gathered on Friday nights. Jessica, on the other hand, was quieter, more introspective. She lived in a modest white house with black shutters, where her mother kept an immaculate garden and her father worked long hours at the grain elevator outside town. Jessica was the one who remembered birthdays, who brought homemade cookies to share, who seemed to genuinely care about everyone's feelings. She was the type of friend who would listen to your problems for hours without judgment, who would defend you when others whispered behind your back. Together, the three girls had created their own little world within the larger community of Trinity Falls. They had their own inside jokes, their own secret places, their own dreams about the future. Sarah trusted these girls completely, the way teenagers trust when they haven't yet learned that trust can be shattered like glass and cut just as deeply. For 2 years, their friendship had been the cornerstone of Sarah's adolescent experience. They had navigated the treacherous waters of middle school together, supporting each other through first crushes, family drama, and the 1,000 small crises that loom so large in a teenager's world. They had sleepovers every weekend, rotating between houses, creating elaborate plans for their futures that involved moving to the same college, being each other's bridesmaids, and raising their children as best friends. Sarah's parents had welcomed Madison and Jessica into their home as if they were family. The girls knew where the extra house key was hidden, knew which snacks were off limits, knew that they could show up unannounced and be greeted with warmth. Similarly, Sarah felt completely at home in both Madison's and Jessica's houses. She knew Madison's grandmother's stories by heart, knew which cabinet held Jessica's mother's good china, knew the family rhythms and routines as intimately as she knew her own. This easy familiarity, this complete trust, this assumption that friendship meant safety, these were the very things that would make what happened next so devastating. Because sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers lurking in shadows, but from the people we love most, the people we never think to guard against. The weeks leading up to September 29th had been ordinary in every way. Sarah had been excited about her upcoming birthday party, spending hours planning every detail with the meticulous attention that only a teenager can bring to such things. She had made lists of decorations, planned the menu, debated the playlist with the seriousness of a wedding planner. Her parents had agreed to let her invite 20 friends, to rent a karaoke machine, to order pizza from 3 different places to accommodate everyone's preferences. Madison and Jessica had been enthusiastically involved in the planning, or so it seemed. They had offered suggestions, volunteered to help with decorations, promised to arrive early to help set up. Looking back, investigators would wonder if their eagerness had a different motivation, if they were already planning something else entirely. But at the time, Sarah saw only the excited participation of her best friends, the shared joy of anticipating a celebration. September 29th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of bright autumn sunshine that makes everything seem possible. Sarah woke up in a good mood, excited about the day ahead. She had no specific plans beyond the usual routine. School, then probably hanging out with Madison and Jessica, maybe working on homework together, or just talking about the party that was now only days away. It was the kind of day that, in her innocence, she expected to be exactly like hundreds of other days that had come before. At breakfast, Sarah's mother mentioned that she would be working a double shift at the diner, covering for a co-worker whose child was sick. This meant Sarah would need to watch Emma for a few extra hours, but she didn't mind. She enjoyed spending time with her little sister, and besides, Madison and Jessica often included Emma in their activities. The little girl adored Sarah's friends, and they seemed to enjoy her company as well, or at least they pretended to for Sarah's sake. School that day was unremarkable. Sarah attended her classes, chatted with classmates, turned in a history report she'd been working on for weeks. She ate lunch with some girls from her English class, discussing the upcoming homecoming dance, and debating whether they were brave enough to ask boys to dance. It was the kind of conversation that seems monumentally important when you're 14, the kind of social navigation that occupies vast amounts of teenage mental energy. After school, Sarah walked home alone, as was her usual routine. Madison and Jessica attended a different high school across town, one that was considered slightly better academically, though the distinction was minimal in a place like Trinity Falls. This separation during school hours made their after-school time together even more precious, even more intensely focused. They had to make up for the hours apart by compressing all their friendship into the evenings and weekends. When Sarah arrived home, she found Emma playing in the living room with her favorite dolls, creating elaborate storylines that only a 4-year-old mind could conjure. Emma's special needs meant that she required more supervision than most children her age, but she was a joy to be around, funny, affectionate, and possessed of an infectious laugh that could brighten the darkest day. Sarah often marveled at her sister's resilience, her ability to find happiness in simple things, despite the challenges she faced. "Mama work?" Emma asked, looking up from her dolls with the solemn expression she wore when discussing serious topics. "Yes, sweetie," Sarah confirmed, settling down on the floor beside her sister. "Mama's working extra today, so it's just you and me for a while." Emma nodded with the gravity of a much older child. Despite her developmental delays, she understood family dynamics with startling clarity, seeming to sense when her needs placed extra pressure on her parents and sister. Sarah often found herself protective not just of Emma's physical safety, but of her emotional well-being, wanting to shield her from any sense that she was a burden. They were playing together when Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Madison. The message was casual, friendly, exactly the kind of communication Sarah received from her friends dozens of times each day. Madison was suggesting they hang out, maybe watch a movie or work on homework together. Nothing in the tone or content suggested anything unusual, anything dangerous. It was just Madison being Madison, reaching out to fill the afternoon hours with friendship and laughter. Sarah responded enthusiastically, but mentioned that she had Emma with her. This had never been a problem before. Both Madison and Jessica seemed to genuinely enjoy Emma's company, often including her in their activities or adapting their plans to accommodate a 4-year-old's needs and attention span. Emma, for her part, was always excited to see Sarah's friends, as she called them, and would spend hours getting ready for these visits as if they were the most important social events of her young life. The text conversation continued for several minutes, with Sarah and Madison working out the details of the afternoon's plans. Jessica would join them at Madison's house, where they could spread out in the finished basement and have privacy to talk about whatever was on their minds. It was a familiar routine, one they'd followed countless times before, and Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came with the prospect of spending time with her best friends. But then came a complication. Sarah's mother called from the diner, explaining that she would need to stay even later than expected. The sick co-worker's situation had worsened, and there was no one else available to cover the evening shift. This meant Sarah would need to watch Emma for several more hours, possibly until quite late. Normally this wouldn't be a problem. Sarah was responsible, Emma was well behaved, and they had established routines for these situations. However, Sarah had been looking forward to seeing Madison and Jessica all day. The approaching birthday party had created an extra sense of excitement and anticipation, a feeling that everything was building towards something wonderful. She didn't want to miss out on an afternoon with her friends, especially when there were party details still to discuss and the kind of important teenage conversations that couldn't wait for another day. After some consideration, Sarah decided to take Emma with her to Madison's house. This had worked well in the past. Emma would play quietly while the older girls talked, occasionally joining in their conversations or games in ways that actually enhanced the fun rather than detracting from it. Both Madison and Jessica had always seemed to enjoy having Emma around, treating her with patience and kindness that made Sarah love them even more. Sarah helped Emma get ready for the visit, letting her choose between 2 favorite outfits and ensuring she brought along her special stuffed animal, a worn rabbit named Hopper, that went everywhere with her. Emma was excited about the prospect of seeing Madison and Jessica, chattering happily about showing them a new dance she'd learned in her therapy sessions. As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt the familiar contentment that came with having all the pieces of her life fitting together nicely. Her sister was happy, her friends were waiting, and the afternoon stretched ahead with unlimited possibilities. She had no way of knowing that she was making the most important decision of her young life, that her choice to bring Emma would save both their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The walk to Madison's house was short and pleasant, following a route Sarah had traveled hundreds of times. They passed the Hendersons' house with its perfectly manicured lawn, the Johnsons' place where 3 cats always seemed to be sunbathing on the front porch, the corner house where old Mr. Patterson grew prize-winning tomatoes that he generously shared with the neighborhood. It was a walk through the familiar geography of childhood, past landmarks that held memories and stories, accumulated over 2 years of friendship. Emma skipped beside her sister, humming a song she'd learned at preschool, and pointing out flowers, dogs, and other items of interest with the enthusiasm that made even the most ordinary walk an adventure. Sarah found herself smiling at her sister's joy, feeling grateful for this uncomplicated happiness that seemed to radiate from Emma despite all her challenges. As they approached Madison Street, Sarah felt her phone buzz again. This time it was Jessica, confirming that she was already at Madison's house and looking forward to seeing Sarah. The message included several emoji that seemed perfectly normal. Hearts, smiley faces, the kind of digital shorthand that teenage girls use to communicate affection and excitement. There was nothing in these communications to suggest that anything was amiss, nothing to trigger even the slightest concern or hesitation. But as they turned the corner onto Madison Street, Sarah noticed something that struck her as slightly odd. Instead of finding Madison and Jessica waiting at the house, she saw them walking toward her, along with a third girl named Ashley Weber, someone Sarah knew from school but wouldn't have considered a close friend. Ashley attended the same school as Madison and Jessica, and while she was friendly enough, she had never been part of their inner circle, never been included in their most important conversations or activities. The presence of Ashley wasn't necessarily alarming. Friend groups expanded and contracted regularly in the fluid social dynamics of teenage life, but something about the way the three girls were walking struck Sarah as unusual. They seemed purposeful, focused, as if they were on some kind of mission rather than simply meeting up for a casual afternoon of friendship. Their body language was different somehow, more intense than the situation seemed to warrant. As the groups converged in the middle of the street, the greetings were warm and enthusiastic, exactly what Sarah expected from her friends. Madison and Jessica hugged her with apparent genuine affection, exclaimed over how cute Emma looked, and began discussing plans for the afternoon. Ashley was friendly as well, complimenting Sarah's outfit and asking about her upcoming birthday party with what seemed like sincere interest. The conversation quickly turned to a supposed school project that Madison, Jessica, and Ashley were working on together. They explained that they needed to finish some research and preparation that evening and asked if Sarah would mind helping them with it. This request seemed perfectly reasonable. The girls often helped each other with homework and projects, and Sarah was actually a stronger student than either Madison or Jessica in several subjects. What happened next was a moment that would replay in Sarah's mind thousands of times in the years to come, a moment that she would analyze and reanalyze, searching for clues she might have missed, warnings she should have heeded. A neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, approached them with a warm smile and began chatting with Sarah about her upcoming birthday party. Mrs. Patterson had known Sarah since the family moved to the neighborhood and had always been particularly kind to Emma, often stopping to admire her drawings or listen to her stories. The conversation with Mrs. Patterson lasted perhaps 5 minutes, covering topics like party decorations, guest lists, and whether Sarah planned to have the celebration indoors or outdoors, depending on the weather. It was the kind of neighborly interaction that made Trinity Falls feel like a real community, where adults took genuine interest in the young people around them. Mrs. Patterson even extended an invitation for Sarah and Emma to come see her new kittens sometime soon, an offer that made Emma practically vibrate with excitement. As Mrs. Patterson walked away, waving goodbye and calling out reminders about the kitten visit, Sarah turned back to her friends. This was the moment when a different choice might have changed everything, when the presence of a caring adult and the option of a different activity presented an alternative path. But Sarah was 14, loyal to her friends, and committed to the plans they had made. She thanked Mrs. Patterson for the invitation and promised to visit soon, then followed Madison, Jessica, and Ashley toward Madison's house. The walk to the house felt different now, though Sarah couldn't have articulated exactly why. The conversation had become more subdued, more focused on the mysterious school project that apparently required all their attention. Emma seemed to sense some change in the atmosphere as well, staying closer to Sarah's side and speaking in the whisper voice she used when she was uncertain about social situations. When they reached Madison's house, Sarah felt a familiar comfort at seeing the blue siding and wraparound porch that had been the setting for so many happy memories. This was where they had spent countless afternoons, where they had shared secrets and dreams, where they had cemented the bonds of friendship that Sarah believed would last forever. The wind chimes on the porch were playing their gentle symphony, and everything looked exactly as it always had. But as they approached the front door, Madison made an unexpected suggestion. Instead of going inside immediately, she proposed that they walk around to the backyard, where they could work on their project in the workshop area that Madison's father had built behind the house. This wasn't entirely unusual. They had spent time in the backyard before, especially during nice weather. But something about the suggestion felt different, more insistent than casual. Sarah agreed without hesitation, trusting her friends completely and assuming that whatever they had planned would be fun and interesting. Emma was happy to go wherever Sarah went, still excited about spending time with the older girls who always made her feel special and included. They made their way around the side of the house, following a familiar path that led to the backyard, where Madison's family sometimes held barbecues and where the girls had played countless games of hide-and-seek and tag. As they walked, Ashley began talking more about their school project, describing it as something related to psychology and human behavior. She mentioned that they were studying different personality types and how people responded to various situations. This sounded academic and legitimate, exactly the kind of assignment that their school might give. Sarah found herself genuinely interested, even excited about the prospect of contributing to something educational and intellectually stimulating. The backyard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence that provided privacy from the neighboring houses. Madison's father's workshop was a substantial structure, more of a small building than a simple shed, equipped with workbenches, tools, and enough space for several people to work comfortably. It was a place where Sarah had spent many happy hours, helping Madison with art projects, or simply talking while Madison's father worked on his various woodworking hobbies. But as they approached the workshop, Sarah began to notice details that seemed off somehow. The building looked different, almost staged, as if it had been prepared for something specific. There were items arranged on the workbenches that she didn't recognize, materials that didn't seem to belong to any normal woodworking project. The atmosphere felt charged with an energy that she couldn't identify, but that made her increasingly uncomfortable. It was at this moment that Emma tugged on Sarah's hand and whispered that she needed to use the bathroom. This simple, innocent request from a 4-year-old would later be recognized as the intervention that saved both their lives, though Sarah didn't understand its significance at the time. She simply responded as any caring big sister would, telling Madison that they needed to go inside the house so Emma could use the facilities. Madison's reaction to this request was immediate and intense, in a way that struck Sarah as completely out of proportion to the situation. She insisted that they couldn't go inside right now, that they needed to start working on the project immediately, that there wasn't time for bathroom breaks. Her tone was sharp, almost panicked, so different from her usual easygoing demeanor that Sarah felt the first real stirring of alarm. Jessica quickly stepped in to support Madison's position, agreeing that they needed to focus on their work and suggesting that Emma could wait a few minutes. Ashley nodded in agreement, adding that they had limited time to complete their project and couldn't afford any delays. The 3 girls seemed to form a united front against what should have been a simple, accommodating request. But Emma was only 4 years old, and when she said she needed to use the bathroom, she meant it with the urgency that only small children possess. She began to fidget and whimper, clearly uncomfortable, and not understanding why the big girls were being so uncooperative about something so basic and necessary. Sarah found herself caught between her loyalty to her friends and her responsibility to her sister, a position that was entirely foreign to her experience with Madison and Jessica. The tension of the moment was broken by an unexpected sound. Madison's mother calling from inside the house, asking if the girls wanted snacks or drinks. This normal, motherly offer of hospitality seemed to panic Madison even more, and she quickly called back that they were fine and didn't need anything. But the interruption had given Sarah a moment to think, to recognize that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. Acting on an instinct she couldn't fully explain, Sarah made a decision that would save her life. She told Madison that she was going to take Emma inside to use the bathroom and that they could start the project when she returned. Despite increasingly frantic protests from all 3 girls, she picked up Emma and walked determinedly toward the house, following the sound of Madison's mother's voice. Once inside, the normalcy of Madison's home environment provided a stark contrast to the strange energy that had been building in the backyard. Madison's mother greeted them warmly, fussed over Emma with genuine affection, and offered the kind of snacks and drinks that had always been part of their friendship routine. Everything felt familiar and safe, exactly as it always had in this house that had been like a second home to Sarah. While Emma used the bathroom, Sarah found herself thinking about the afternoon's events, trying to understand why everything had felt so wrong. Madison's behavior, Jessica's unusual intensity, Ashley's presence in what was supposed to be a casual friend gathering, none of it made sense in the context of their normal relationship. For the first time in their 2-year friendship, Sarah felt genuinely uncertain about her friend's intentions. When Emma emerged from the bathroom, chattering happily about the decorative soaps and colorful towels, Sarah made another life-saving decision. She told Madison's mother that Emma wasn't feeling well and that they needed to go home. It was a lie, but one that felt necessary in ways Sarah couldn't fully articulate. Madison's mother, concerned and caring as always, immediately offered to drive them home or to call Sarah's mother or to do anything else that might help. Sarah declined the offers of additional help, but accepted Madison's mother's suggestion that she call to check on Emma later. As they prepared to leave, Madison, Jessica, and Ashley appeared from the backyard, their faces showing a mixture of disappointment and something else that Sarah couldn't quite identify. They tried to convince her to stay, suggesting that Emma could rest inside while they worked on their project, offering to postpone the work until another day, doing everything possible to prevent her departure. But Sarah had made her decision, and she stuck to it with the kind of determination that would serve her well in the challenges to come. She said goodbye to her friends, promised to call later, and left Madison's house with Emma in tow, walking back along the familiar streets of Meadowbrook Estates toward the safety of her own home. It wasn't until much later, when the full scope of what had been planned was revealed, that Sarah would understand how close she had come to a fate worse than death. The project that Madison, Jessica, and Ashley had been so eager to begin wasn't academic at all. It was something far more sinister, something that would have destroyed not just Sarah's life, but Emma's as well. In the twisted logic of 14-year-old minds pushed beyond reason by forces that investigators would spend months trying to understand, both sisters had been targeted for elimination. The evening that followed was ordinary in every way, marked only by Sarah's nagging sense that something important had happened, though she couldn't say what. Emma played with her toys. Sarah worked on homework. They had dinner together when their mother returned from work. It was the kind of unremarkable evening that makes up the vast majority of family life, precious in its very ordinariness. But somewhere across the neighborhood, 3 teenage girls were dealing with the frustration of plans gone awry, with carefully laid preparations that had been disrupted by the simple bathroom needs of a 4-year-old. What they did with that frustration, how they channeled their disappointment, and what they decided to do next would determine whether September 29th, 2016 would be remembered as the day Sarah Miller's life was saved, or merely the first day of something much worse. Because sometimes escaping danger once only means that it's waiting for you somewhere else, perhaps in a form even more terrible than you originally imagined. And sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who pose the greatest threat, simply because they're the ones you never think to run from. The investigation that would eventually uncover the full truth of what had been planned that day was still months away. The arrests, the trials, the media attention that would make Trinity Falls infamous, all of that was yet to come. For now, there was only a 14-year-old girl putting her 4-year-old sister to bed, completely unaware that she had just walked away from her own execution. But the story was far from over, because what Sarah didn't know, what no one in Trinity Falls could have imagined, was that this was only the beginning. The real horror, the truly unthinkable events that would finally reveal the depths of teenage cruelty and the devastating power of betrayal, were still waiting in the shadows. And next time, there would be no bathroom breaks to save her, no mother's voice to interrupt the proceedings, no sudden instinct to guide her to safety. Next time, Sarah would have to face whatever her friends had planned with nothing but her own courage and the desperate will to survive. And next time, the whole world would be watching. 3 days later, October 2nd, 2016, Sarah Miller would discover that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly when you feel safest. Sometimes evil wears the face of friendship, speaks in the voice of love, and strikes when your guard is completely down. What happened to Sarah on that autumn afternoon would challenge everything I thought I knew about the capacity for cruelty in the human heart, especially when that heart belongs to someone barely past childhood. The morning started like any other in the Miller household. Sarah woke up thinking about her upcoming birthday party, now just days away. She had spent the weekend finalizing details, confirming RSVPs, and dealing with the normal teenage anxiety about whether everything would be perfect. Her mother was working another double shift at the diner, and Emma was at her weekly therapy session with their aunt, leaving Sarah with a rare few hours of solitude that she planned to use for party preparation. But around noon, her phone buzzed with a message that would change the trajectory of her life forever. It was Madison, reaching out with what seemed like a casual invitation to hang out. The tone was friendly, normal, exactly the kind of message Sarah had received hundreds of times before. There was no hint of the darkness that lay behind those simple words. No suggestion that this would be anything other than another ordinary afternoon with her best friends. What Sarah didn't know, what no one in Trinity Falls could have imagined, was that Madison, Jessica, and Ashley had spent the 3 days since their failed attempt planning something far more sinister than any school project. They had been consumed by their failure, obsessed with the humiliation of having their carefully laid plans disrupted by the innocent needs of a 4-year-old child. In the twisted logic of teenage minds pushed beyond reason, they had convinced themselves that their friendship with Sarah had been nothing but a lie, that she had somehow betrayed them by choosing her sister's welfare over their mysterious project. The psychology of what drives children to commit acts of unspeakable violence has been studied extensively, but it remains one of the most disturbing and incomprehensible aspects of human behavior. These weren't troubled youth from broken homes or victims of abuse themselves. Madison and Jessica came from stable, middle-class families in a safe, supportive community. They attended good schools, participated in normal activities, and had never shown signs of the capacity for such extreme cruelty. Yet somehow in the space of 3 days, they had transformed from Sarah's best friends into something far more dangerous. Later investigation would reveal that a 4th person had been recruited for their plan, a girl named Brittany Walsh, who attended their school but had never been part of Sarah's social circle. Brittany was older, 17, with a reputation for being tough and intimidating. She had agreed to be the one who would actually carry out the final act of their plan, the one who would ensure that Sarah never told anyone what had happened. But fate, in the form of a broken-down city bus, would intervene in ways that none of them could have anticipated. When Sarah received Madison's message that afternoon, she responded with the eager enthusiasm of someone who genuinely missed her friends and was looking forward to spending time with them. The strange tension from 3 days earlier had faded in her memory, replaced by the assumption that whatever had made that afternoon feel odd was simply her imagination. Teenagers are remarkably resilient in their ability to move past uncomfortable moments, to assume the best about the people they love, and Sarah was no exception. Madison's message mentioned that Jessica was already at her house and that they were working on a follow-up project to the one they had started earlier in the week. She asked if Sarah could come over to help them finish it, emphasizing that they really needed her input and assistance. The request seemed perfectly reasonable, exactly the kind of collaborative friendship activity that had defined their relationship for 2 years. Sarah texted back that she would be there soon, then took time to change clothes and fix her hair. She was excited about seeing her friends, about being needed and included in whatever academic endeavor they were pursuing. She had no way of knowing that every minute she spent getting ready was being tracked, that her friends were waiting with a level of anticipation that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with a plan that defied all rational understanding. The walk to Madison's house followed the same familiar route that Sarah had traveled countless times before. She passed the same landmarks, noticed the same details, felt the same sense of belonging in this neighborhood that had become her home. The autumn air was crisp and clear, with the kind of bright sunshine that made everything seem possible. Political campaign vehicles were making their rounds through the subdivision, their loudspeakers blaring messages about upcoming elections, creating a backdrop of civic normalcy that would later seem grimly ironic. When Sarah arrived at Madison's house, she found Madison and Jessica waiting for her with apparent enthusiasm. They greeted her with hugs and smiles that seemed genuine, expressed gratitude for her willingness to help with their project, and began explaining what they needed her to do. Everything about their behavior appeared normal, friendly, exactly what Sarah expected from her closest friends. What followed next would be burned into my memory as one of the most calculated acts of betrayal I have ever encountered in 3 decades of investigating violent crime. Madison and Jessica led Sarah not into the house where they had always spent their time together, but around to the backyard workshop where their previous meeting had felt so uncomfortable. They explained that they needed privacy for their project, that the workshop would provide better space for the kind of work they needed to do. As they walked toward the workshop, Sarah noticed details that should have alarmed her, but didn't, because she was seeing them through the lens of trust rather than suspicion. The building looked different somehow, arranged and prepared in ways that suggested specific planning. There were items present that didn't belong to any normal workshop activity, materials that seemed oddly out of place. But Sarah was 14, trusting, and completely unprepared to recognize the signs of premeditation that were all around her. Once inside the workshop, the mask of friendship began to slip away with terrifying swiftness. What had seemed like enthusiastic collaboration quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister. Madison and Jessica began to change before Sarah's eyes, their familiar faces transforming into expressions of cold determination that she had never seen before. The psychological shift was so complete, so jarring, that Sarah found herself struggling to understand what was happening, even as her instincts began screaming warnings. The attack, when it came, was sudden and overwhelming. These girls, who had been Sarah's closest friends, who had shared her secrets and dreams, who had been welcomed into her family as sisters, turned on her with a violence that defied comprehension. They struck her without warning, without explanation, with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper and darker than simple teenage anger. Sarah's first instinct was to defend herself, to fight back against this incomprehensible assault from people she loved. But she was outnumbered, caught completely off guard, and paralyzed by the psychological shock of betrayal by her closest friends. How do you fight against people you trust completely? How do you defend yourself when your attackers are the very people you would normally turn to for protection? As the initial assault continued, Sarah felt herself becoming disoriented, overwhelmed by the physical pain and emotional trauma of what was happening. At some point during this phase of the attack, she lost consciousness, whether from the blows she was receiving or from the sheer psychological shock of the situation. When she regained awareness, she found herself in a position that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. She was seated in a chair bound with ropes and cloth, completely helpless and at the mercy of girls who had once been her best friends. Her body was racked with nausea, causing her to vomit repeatedly, while Madison and Jessica watched with expressions that showed no trace of the compassion or concern they had always shown her before. It was as if they had become completely different people, transformed by some dark force that had consumed every trace of their former selves. What happened next revealed a level of premeditation that chilled investigating officers to the bone. Madison and Jessica had prepared not just the physical aspects of their attack, but had created detailed plans for what they intended to do to their former friend. They had made lists, assigned roles, and developed a systematic approach to torture that demonstrated planning and forethought that seemed impossible to reconcile with their ages and backgrounds. They told Sarah exactly what they planned to do to her, describing each act of violence with the clinical detachment of surgeons discussing a medical procedure. They would cut off her fingers, both from her hands and her feet. They would remove her tongue to prevent her from screaming. They would mutilate her in ways that demonstrated both creativity and cruelty that seemed to come from some primal evil, rather than from the minds of teenage girls from suburban Georgia. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical violence. Madison and Jessica told Sarah that they were doing this because they loved her, because they wanted to teach her to appreciate the good life she had been given. They claimed that she had taken their friendship for granted, that she didn't value the things that mattered, that she needed to learn hard lessons about gratitude and humility. The twisted logic of their justifications was perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself, because it revealed minds that had found ways to rationalize the unthinkable. As the afternoon wore on, the torture escalated in ways that tested the limits of human endurance. They cut off Sarah's hair with deliberate cruelty, using the act not just to inflict physical change, but to rob her of something she valued about her appearance. They struck her head repeatedly with a mason's pickaxe, creating more than 30 puncture wounds that would require extensive medical treatment. Each blow was calculated not just to cause pain, but to reinforce their complete control over her life and death. The sounds of the political campaign vehicles passing by the house created a surreal backdrop to the horror unfolding in the workshop. Normal life was continuing just yards away, with candidates seeking votes and neighbors going about their daily routines, while Sarah endured torture that belonged in the darkest chapters of human history, rather than in a suburban backyard in Trinity Falls, Georgia. At one point during the ordeal, someone knocked on the front door of Madison's house. For a moment, Sarah's heart leaped with hope that rescue had arrived, that someone had realized what was happening and come to help her. But it was only a campaign worker delivering political flyers, a routine interaction that Madison handled with casual normalcy, while Sarah remained bound and tortured just yards away. The contrast between the ordinary politeness of the front door conversation and the unspeakable cruelty happening in the backyard illustrated the complete disconnection between the public faces these girls maintained and the monsters they had become in private. Throughout the torture, Madison and Jessica's phones were ringing constantly with calls from Brittany Walsh, the 17-year-old who was supposed to arrive and complete their plan. Brittany was stuck on a broken-down city bus somewhere between her neighborhood and Madison's house, frustrated by delays that were preventing her from carrying out her assigned role in Sarah's murder. The phone calls became increasingly frantic as the afternoon wore on, with Brittany demanding to know why they were taking so long and insisting that she needed to be there to finish what they had started. But time was running out for the attackers in ways they hadn't anticipated. Madison's mother was scheduled to return from work, and the extended torture session was approaching the limits of the window they had available. The girls who had planned every detail of their attack had failed to account for the simple realities of family schedules and parental supervision that governed teenage life, even in the midst of the most extreme circumstances. As 4 o'clock approached, Madison made the decision that would save Sarah's life, though not for reasons of mercy or conscience. She told Jessica that they would have to finish their work without waiting for Brittany, not because they had developed any sympathy for their victim, but because they were running out of time before adult supervision returned to the house. In a final, grotesque gesture of their twisted relationship, Madison and Jessica dressed themselves in clothes that Sarah had given them over the months of their friendship. Sarah had always been generous with her possessions, sharing clothes and accessories with friends who had less than she did. Now these same garments became uniforms for murder, worn by her attackers as they prepared to end her life with items that had once represented the bonds of friendship and sharing. Madison approached Sarah as she sat bound and helpless, embracing her with a hug that was both tender and terrifying. She told Sarah that she loved her, that everything they had done was motivated by affection and a desire to help her grow as a person. The psychological manipulation of this moment, expressing love while inflicting torture, claiming care while planning murder, represented a level of emotional cruelty that seemed to transcend normal human evil. They then showed Sarah something that would haunt her dreams for years to come, a grave they had dug in the backyard, a crude but functional hole in the earth where they planned to bury her body. The sight of her own grave, prepared with the same methodical planning that had characterized every aspect of their attack, drove home the reality that her friends truly intended to kill her. This wasn't elaborate psychological torture designed to frighten and intimidate. This was genuine preparation for murder. The attackers forced Sarah from the chair where she had been bound and brought her to the edge of the grave they had prepared. They pushed her down into the hole and began covering her with dirt, burying her alive while she was still conscious and aware. The psychological terror of feeling earth covering her body while she was helpless to resist created a level of horror that few people ever experience and survive. As Sarah lay partially buried, Madison positioned herself with a knife aimed at Sarah's chest, preparing to deliver the killing blow that would end their former friend's life. In that moment, Sarah found resources of strength and will that she didn't know she possessed. As the knife descended toward her heart, she managed to twist her body just enough to avoid a fatal wound, though the blade still penetrated deeply into her shoulder, passing completely through her body and emerging from the other side. The sight of the knife protruding from Sarah's shoulder seemed to shock Madison in ways that all the previous violence had not. For the first time since the attack began, Madison's face showed something that might have been recognition of the reality of what they were doing. The clinical detachment that had characterized her behavior throughout the torture session cracked momentarily, revealing perhaps a glimpse of the normal teenage girl she had once been. But Madison's momentary shock was quickly replaced by renewed determination to complete their plan. She grasped the knife handle and attempted to withdraw it from Sarah's shoulder, presumably to inflict additional wounds that would ensure death. However, the blade had become lodged in bone and tissue, making removal difficult and requiring more force than Madison had anticipated. This delay, caused by the mechanical difficulty of removing a deeply embedded knife, provided Sarah with the opportunity that would save her life. In a moment of clarity that transcended her pain and terror, she realized that her only chance of survival lay in escape, regardless of how impossible it seemed given her physical condition and restraints. What happened next defied not only probability, but seemingly the laws of physics themselves. Sarah, with her hands bound behind her back, her feet tied together, and a knife protruding from her shoulder, somehow managed to rise from the grave where she was partially buried and make her way to the fence that enclosed Madison's backyard. How she accomplished this feat remains unclear even to Sarah herself, as if her desperate will to survive had enabled her to transcend normal human limitations. Climbing over a 6-foot wooden fence with bound hands and feet, while severely injured, should have been impossible, yet somehow Sarah managed to pull herself up and over the barrier that separated Madison's property from the vacant lot next door. She fell hard on the other side, the impact driving pain through her already traumatized body, but she was now outside the immediate reach of her attackers. The vacant lot provided no safety, only a temporary reprieve from immediate danger. Sarah knew she needed to find help, but her appearance, bloodied with a knife protruding from her shoulder, her hands and feet still bound, would terrify any potential rescuer who might mistake her for something other than a victim in desperate need of assistance. She made her way to another fence, this one surrounding the property of a neighbor whose house faced a different street. Again, defying physical limitations that should have made such movement impossible, she managed to climb over this second barrier and land in the backyard of someone she hoped might provide the help she desperately needed. The homeowner, a middle-aged woman whose name would later be recorded in police reports as Patricia Williams, was terrified by the sudden appearance of a bleeding, bound teenager in her backyard. Sarah's appearance was so shocking, so far outside the realm of normal suburban experience, that Mrs. Williams initially couldn't process what she was seeing. She demanded that Sarah leave her property, apparently unable to recognize the desperate need for help that was right in front of her. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but her voice was weak from blood loss and trauma, and her story was so extreme that it might have sounded unbelievable to someone unprepared for such horror. Mrs. Williams, whether from fear, confusion, or simple inability to comprehend the situation, continued to insist that Sarah leave her yard immediately. The presence of Mrs. Williams's large dog, which barked incessantly at the intrusion, added another layer of chaos to an already desperate situation. Sarah, weak from blood loss and still with the knife embedded in her shoulder, realized that she couldn't remain in this yard where she was unwelcome, but she also knew that she couldn't survive much longer without medical attention. In a moment of clarity that cut through her pain and desperation, Sarah understood that the knife in her shoulder posed an immediate threat to her survival. Medical training teaches that embedded objects should never be removed except by trained professionals, as removal can cause catastrophic bleeding. But Sarah was 14 years old, traumatized, and operating on pure survival instinct rather than medical knowledge. She grasped the knife handle and pulled with strength born of desperation, removing the blade that had passed completely through her shoulder. The immediate result was exactly what medical professionals would have predicted, a massive hemorrhage that sent blood flowing from both the entry and exit wounds. But in Sarah's traumatized mind, the removal of the knife felt like a victory, a reclaiming of control over her own body after hours of helplessness. As blood flowed from her wounds, Sarah made a decision that demonstrated both her intelligence and her determination to survive, even if she couldn't save herself. She began deliberately spreading her blood on every surface she could reach: walls, fences, plants, anything that might preserve DNA evidence that could identify her and her attackers. Even facing what she believed was imminent death, she was thinking about justice, about ensuring that the truth of what had happened would eventually be discovered. Sarah's cries for help finally reached someone willing and able to respond. A neighbor in an adjacent yard, Linda Chen, ironically sharing a surname with one of Sarah's attackers, though they were unrelated, heard the commotion and immediately recognized that someone was in desperate need of assistance. Unlike Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Chen didn't hesitate or question the bizarre nature of the situation. She simply saw a child who needed help and responded with the compassion that the situation demanded. "Jump over here, honey," Mrs. Chen called out. "I'll help you." But Sarah's strength was finally failing. The combination of blood loss, physical trauma, and emotional shock had pushed her body beyond its limits. As she tried to make her way toward Mrs. Chen's voice, she collapsed, falling unconscious in Mrs. Williams' yard, while blood continued to flow from her wounds. What happened next would be remembered by Mrs. Williams for the rest of her life, as either the moment she found her humanity or the moment she nearly lost it forever. Faced with an unconscious, severely injured child bleeding to death in her backyard, she was forced to choose between her fear and her conscience. Whatever had initially motivated her to turn away this desperate child, she now recognized the magnitude of the emergency before her. Mrs. Williams dragged Sarah's unconscious body into her house and placed her on the living room sofa, finally removing the remaining ropes and cloths that had bound her hands and feet. As she worked to free Sarah from her restraints, the full extent of the injuries became apparent. Dozens of puncture wounds on her head, the massive shoulder wound, and evidence of systematic torture that would have challenged the comprehension of seasoned emergency responders. When Mrs. Williams called 911, her voice was shaking with an intensity that immediately conveyed the severity of the situation to the emergency dispatcher. She tried to describe what she was seeing, but the words seemed inadequate to capture the horror of Sarah's condition. The dispatcher, recognizing the critical nature of the emergency, immediately dispatched paramedics and police units to the address, while staying on the line to provide medical guidance. One of the first pieces of medical advice the dispatcher provided was that Sarah should not be given any fluids, as internal injuries might make water consumption dangerous and potentially fatal. This guidance came too late. Sarah had regained consciousness and was experiencing the desperate thirst that often accompanies severe blood loss. Despite Mrs. Williams's attempts to prevent it, Sarah made her way to the refrigerator and consumed nearly a liter of water before anyone could stop her. "I'm going to die anyway," Sarah told Mrs. Williams, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that sometimes comes to people facing their own mortality. "I don't want to die thirsty." While Mrs. Williams was providing emergency care and waiting for paramedics to arrive, Mrs. Chen's teenage daughter had made her way to the Miller family home to alert Sarah's mother about the emergency. This act of neighborly responsibility would prove crucial, as Sarah's mother had been unaware that anything was wrong and might not have been reached in time if help had depended solely on official emergency notification procedures. When Sarah's mother, Janet Miller, received word that her daughter had been seriously injured, her first instinct was to ensure Emma's safety before rushing to help Sarah. She asked Mrs. Chen's daughter to stay with Emma, locking the doors and keeping the 4-year-old safe inside until other arrangements could be made. This decision would later prove prescient, as one of Sarah's attackers was indeed watching the Miller house, waiting to see what would happen next. Janet Miller's arrival at Mrs. Williams' house marked the beginning of a new phase of trauma that would affect the entire family for years to come. Seeing her daughter's condition, bloodied, barely conscious, with dozens of visible wounds, caused Janet to go into shock herself. She began hyperventilating, crying uncontrollably, and struggling to maintain the composure necessary to help with Sarah's care. Sarah, despite her own critical condition, found herself trying to comfort her mother rather than seeking comfort for herself. She attempted to cover her wounds, particularly the head injuries, because she believed her skull had been cracked open and didn't want her mother to see the full extent of the damage. This instinct to protect others, even while facing her own mortality, would become a defining characteristic of Sarah's recovery process. The wait for emergency medical services felt interminable, though records would later show that response time was actually within normal parameters for their rural location. When it became clear that waiting for an ambulance might cost precious time that Sarah couldn't afford to lose, Mrs. Williams made the decision to transport Sarah to the nearest medical facility by private car. The nearest facility was a small urgent care clinic that was clearly unprepared for the severity of Sarah's injuries. The medical staff, accustomed to treating minor injuries and routine illnesses, were overwhelmed by the extent of trauma they encountered. After a quick assessment, They informed Janet Miller that Sarah's condition was beyond their capabilities and that she needed to be transferred immediately to a major trauma center in Atlanta. She's dehydrated, she's hemorrhaging, and she has injuries whose severity we can't determine here, the attending physician explained to Janet Miller. If you have family members who live far away, you should contact them now. We don't know what we're going to find when we do more detailed examinations. The ambulance ride to Atlanta's Grady Memorial Hospital was a blur of sirens, medical equipment, and paramedics working frantically to stabilize Sarah's condition during transport. Janet Miller rode alongside her daughter, holding her hand and trying to provide comfort, while simultaneously preparing herself for the possibility that these might be their last moments together. At Grady Memorial, Sarah was immediately taken into trauma assessment, where teams of specialists began the process of cataloging and treating her injuries. The initial examinations revealed the full scope of what had been done to her: 32 puncture wounds to her head and scalp, the massive shoulder wound that had somehow missed major arteries and organs, and extensive bruising and lacerations throughout her body. What amazed the medical team was not just the extent of Sarah's injuries, but the fact that she had survived them at all. The head wounds inflicted with a mason's pickaxe had somehow avoided penetrating her skull or causing traumatic brain injury. The shoulder wound, despite passing completely through her body, had missed every major blood vessel and organ system that could have caused immediate death. "It's miraculous," one of the attending physicians told Janet Miller after the initial assessment was complete. "Based on the nature and number of her injuries, she shouldn't have survived the attack, much less been conscious and mobile enough to escape. Someone was watching over your daughter today." The only lasting physical damage from the attack would be what doctors termed ocular hemorrhaging, burst blood vessels in Sarah's eyes that gave them a frightening red appearance, but posed no threat to her vision or long-term health. Even this dramatic-looking injury would heal completely within a week, leaving no permanent physical reminders of her ordeal. But while Sarah's body began the process of healing with remarkable speed, the emotional and psychological trauma would prove more challenging to address. The betrayal by her closest friends, the systematic torture, and the knowledge that people she had loved and trusted had planned her death created wounds that would require years of therapy and support to heal. Within 24 hours of the attack, the Miller family had made the decision to leave Trinity Falls forever. Janet Miller, despite being injured herself, she had broken her foot during the panicked rush to help Sarah and had never found time to seek medical treatment, organized their belongings and arranged for them to move to a different state where they could begin rebuilding their lives away from the scene of such trauma. As the Miller family prepared to leave the only home Sarah had known for 2 years, police in Trinity Falls were beginning an investigation that would eventually uncover evidence so disturbing that it would challenge their understanding of juvenile crime and the capacity for evil in seemingly normal teenagers. But that investigation was still in its early stages, and many of the most shocking revelations were yet to come. For now, there was only a 14-year-old girl who had survived the unthinkable, a family trying to process trauma beyond their comprehension, and a small town that was about to discover that evil could bloom in the most unexpected places, wearing the face of friendship and speaking in the voice of love. The hardest truth of all was still ahead. Sometimes the people who know us best are the ones most capable of destroying us completely. What had happened to Sarah Miller would eventually become a case study in criminal psychology, an investigation that would reveal evidence so disturbing that experienced detectives would struggle to maintain their professional composure. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was only survival and the beginning of a long journey toward healing that would test every assumption about forgiveness, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. In my 3 decades of investigating violent crimes, I've learned that the aftermath of violence often reveals as much about human nature as the violence itself. Sometimes, the systems we trust to deliver justice become part of the trauma. Sometimes the people we expect to show remorse reveal depths of callousness that exceed even their original crimes. And sometimes, the very mechanisms designed to protect victims become instruments of further victimization. What happened to Sarah Miller in the days and weeks following her escape would challenge every assumption I held about juvenile justice, victim protection, and the capacity of our legal system to respond appropriately to cases that transcend normal categories of crime. This wasn't just a story about teenage violence. It was a story about how institutions can fail victims almost as catastrophically as their original attackers. The morning after the attack, October 3rd, 2016, Sarah and her mother made their way to the county medical examiner's office for the forensic examination that would officially document her injuries and provide crucial evidence for the eventual prosecution of her attackers. Janet Miller was hobbling on her broken foot, which she still hadn't found time to properly treat, while Sarah moved carefully to avoid aggravating the dozens of wounds that covered her body. The drive to the medical examiner's office was surreal in its ordinariness. They passed the same streets, the same landmarks, the same everyday scenes of small-town life that had formed the backdrop of Sarah's childhood. But everything felt different now, as if the attack had created an invisible barrier between Sarah and the normal world, making her an observer of a life she could no longer fully participate in. What they discovered during the forensic examination would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. Despite having endured hours of systematic torture less than 24 hours earlier, Sarah's body showed almost no visible signs of trauma beyond the documented injuries to her head and shoulder. The extensive bruising and swelling that medical professionals would have expected to see was mysteriously absent. "It's remarkable," the forensic examiner told Janet Miller as he documented Sarah's injuries. "Based on what she's described and the wounds I can see, I would have expected much more visible trauma. Her body seems to have an extraordinary capacity for healing." The examiner photographed and catalogued each of the 32 puncture wounds on Sarah's head and scalp, documenting their depth, pattern, and location with the clinical precision required for legal proceedings. The shoulder wound was examined and measured, its path through Sarah's body traced and recorded. But the absence of the widespread bruising and swelling that should have accompanied such systematic violence remained a medical anomaly that defied easy explanation. During the examination, a victim services coordinator provided Sarah and her mother with information that would prove both reassuring and terrifying. The coordinator explained that all 4 of Sarah's attackers had been identified and were in the process of being arrested, but that the investigation was ongoing and could take months to complete. Sarah felt relief at knowing her attackers were being held accountable, but also a creeping dread about what the legal process would require of her. What neither Sarah nor her mother knew at that moment was that the investigation had already uncovered evidence that would shock even seasoned law enforcement professionals. While Sarah was undergoing her forensic examination, detectives in Trinity Falls were processing a piece of evidence that would transform the case from a local incident into a national sensation and a nightmare that would follow Sarah for years to come. Ashley Weber, the girl who had filmed the attack, had made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. Rather than hiding the evidence of her involvement in Sarah's torture, she had voluntarily presented herself at the hospital where Sarah was being treated, claiming to have witnessed the attack and offering to provide evidence to help with the investigation. Her motivations for this bizarre behavior would never be fully understood, even by criminal psychologists who later studied the case. Perhaps she believed that positioning herself as a witness rather than a participant would somehow minimize her culpability. Perhaps she was experiencing genuine remorse and guilt that overwhelmed her sense of self-preservation. Or perhaps she was simply a 14-year-old girl who had participated in something so far beyond her comprehension that she couldn't think clearly about the consequences of her actions. Whatever her reasoning, Ashley's decision to voluntarily turn herself in, while simultaneously providing video evidence of her own participation in torture, would prove to be the break that investigators needed to understand the full scope of what had happened to Sarah. But it would also create complications that no one anticipated, particularly regarding the distribution and eventual public release of the attack footage. When Ashley arrived at the hospital, claiming to have witnessed Sarah's attack and offering video evidence, she was immediately detained by hospital security while police were called to the scene. Her parents were contacted and arrived within hours, accompanied by an attorney who would prove to be far more competent than the teenage client deserved. But the damage was already done. Ashley had handed over the cell phone containing footage that would become some of the most disturbing evidence ever processed in a juvenile criminal case. Detective Maria Santos, the lead investigator assigned to Sarah's case, would later describe viewing the attack footage as one of the most challenging experiences of her 20-year career in law enforcement. The video revealed not just the systematic nature of the torture Sarah had endured, but the casual, almost festive atmosphere in which it had been conducted. Madison, Jessica, and Ashley could be seen laughing and joking as they inflicted pain on their former friend, treating her suffering as entertainment rather than recognizing it as the profound violation of human dignity that it represented. In 30 years of police work, I've seen a lot of things that test your faith in humanity, Detective Santos later told reporters. But watching those girls torture someone they claim to love, watching them enjoy it, watching them plan each act of cruelty, that was something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. The video evidence also revealed details about the attack that Sarah's traumatized memory had been unable to provide. It showed the extensive preparation that had gone into the torture session, the specific weapons and tools that had been gathered, and the methodical way in which each act of violence had been planned and executed. Most disturbing of all, it captured the attackers' own words as they explained their motivations and justified their actions to themselves and their victim. By the weekend following the attack, all 4 girls had been arrested and were being held in the county's juvenile detention facility pending formal charges. Madison Torres, Jessica Chen, Ashley Weber, and Brittany Walsh, 4 teenagers whose names would soon become synonymous with a case that challenged everything the public thought they knew about juvenile crime. The arrest of Brittany Walsh had been particularly dramatic. Police had surrounded her home on Sunday evening, October 5th, after determining her identity through social media posts and cell phone records that placed her in communication with the other attackers throughout the day of the assault. Brittany had been at home with her family, apparently living a normal weekend routine when police arrived to arrest her for conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah learned about the arrests on Monday morning, October 6th, when she arrived at the Trinity Falls Police Department to provide her formal statement to investigators. The sight that greeted her outside the police station was unlike anything she could have imagined. Television news trucks, reporters, and camera crews that had descended on the small town overnight as word of the case began to spread through media networks. "This is what happens when evil wears the face of childhood," one reporter was saying into a camera as Sarah and her mother approached the police station. 4 teenage girls in rural Georgia allegedly tortured their friend for hours, filming the attack and preparing to bury her alive. The victim, whose identity we're not revealing due to her age, somehow escaped and is helping police understand what investigators are calling one of the most disturbing cases of juvenile violence in state history. Inside the police station, Detective Santos greeted Sarah with a mixture of professional composure and personal warmth that immediately put her at ease. Unlike many law enforcement officials who struggle to communicate effectively with teenage victims, Detective Santos had a natural ability to speak to Sarah as both a traumatized child who needed protection and a crucial witness whose testimony would be essential for prosecution. "Sarah," Detective Santos said, leading her and her mother to a comfortable interview room, "I want you to know that all 4 of the girls who hurt you are in custody. They're being held at the Juvenile Detention Center, and they're going to face serious charges for what they did to you. But I need your help to make sure we have all the information we need to see that justice is done." The formal interview process took nearly 3 hours, during which Sarah recounted every detail she could remember about the attack, the events leading up to it, and her relationship with her attackers. Detective Santos was patient and thorough, asking clarifying questions and ensuring that Sarah's statement was as complete and accurate as possible. The detective's approach was professional but compassionate, recognizing the difficulty of asking a 14-year-old to relive the worst experience of her life. But it was at the end of this interview that Sarah experienced something that would haunt her almost as much as the original attack itself. Detective Santos asked if Sarah wanted to see her attackers, explaining that they were being held in the same facility and that victim identification was part of the standard procedure. Against her better judgment, and despite her mother's visible reluctance, Sarah agreed to view the girls who had tried to murder her. She was led to an observation room where she could see into the detention area without being seen herself. What she witnessed there would shatter any remaining illusions she might have had about her former friend's capacity for remorse or rehabilitation. Madison, Jessica, Ashley, and Brittany were sitting together in the common area of the detention facility, talking and laughing as if they were at a social gathering rather than facing charges for attempted murder. When they noticed movement at the observation window, they turned toward Sarah's location and despite supposedly not being able to see her clearly, began laughing in a way that felt deliberately cruel and mocking. "They're laughing at me," Sarah whispered to Detective Santos, her voice breaking with the realization that even facing serious criminal charges, her attackers felt no remorse for what they had done to her. This disturbing display of callousness would be confirmed in later interviews with the attackers, where their lack of genuine remorse became a central focus of the investigation. When asked by reporters if she regretted her actions, one of the girls responded with chilling honesty, "I regret not finishing what we started. I was weak because I couldn't handle seeing blood." The contrast between these public statements and their later, more carefully coached responses to attorneys and social workers revealed a calculated approach to managing their legal situation rather than any genuine understanding of the gravity of their actions. In their initial statements to police, the girls had been frank about their intentions and their disappointment at not successfully killing Sarah. As their cases progressed through the legal system, their responses became more rehearsed and apologetic, but the damage of their honest initial reactions had already been done. It was during this same week that Sarah and her family learned about the existence of the attack video, though they were initially unaware that it had already begun circulating beyond law enforcement channels. Detective Santos explained that Ashley had filmed the torture session, but assured Sarah that the footage was being treated as sensitive evidence and would only be viewed by investigators and legal professionals who needed to see it for prosecution purposes. What Detective Santos didn't know at that time was that the video had already found its way beyond official channels through mechanisms that would never be fully explained or investigated. By the end of October 2016, footage of Sarah's torture was being shared through social media platforms, viewed by thousands of people who had no connection to the case, and discussed in online forums where the most disturbing content finds an audience among people who seek out such material for entertainment. The viral spread of the attack video created a secondary trauma for Sarah that was almost as devastating as the original assault. She became not just a victim of torture, but a victim of voyeurism, with her most traumatic moments being consumed as entertainment by strangers around the world. The knowledge that thousands of people had watched her suffering, that her torture had become a form of viral content, added a layer of humiliation and violation that would take years to process and overcome. Sarah first learned about the video's online circulation through social media notifications on her phone. Friends and classmates sending her links and asking if the footage really showed her being attacked. The casual way in which people shared and discussed her trauma, as if it were just another piece of shocking internet content, demonstrated a level of social callousness that rivaled the cruelty of her original attackers. People were sharing it like it was a movie, Sarah would later recall. They were commenting on it, discussing whether it was real or fake, treating my pain like it was entertainment. Some people even said I deserved it, that I must have done something to make my friends angry. It was like being attacked all over again, but this time by strangers who didn't even know me. The legal proceedings that followed would prove to be almost as traumatic as the original attack, characterized by procedural irregularities, inadequate victim protections, and a juvenile justice system that seemed unprepared to handle a case of such severity and public attention. Sarah's first indication that the legal process would be problematic came in the form of a phone call that should never have been made. On a Tuesday morning in November 2016, Sarah's phone rang with a call from the county courthouse. The caller, a clerk in the juvenile division, informed Sarah that she needed to appear for a court hearing the following day at noon. The caller provided no additional information about the purpose of the hearing, the rights she might have as a victim, or the possibility of legal representation. "Do I need a lawyer?" Sarah asked the clerk, demonstrating a maturity beyond her years in recognizing the potential importance of legal counsel. "No, you don't need a lawyer," the clerk responded, providing advice that would later be recognized as both inappropriate and potentially harmful to Sarah's interests. "Just show up tomorrow at noon and be ready to answer questions about what happened." This phone call violated numerous protocols designed to protect juvenile victims in criminal proceedings. Sarah should not have been contacted directly by court personnel. Her parents should have been notified through proper channels. She should have been informed of her rights, including the right to legal representation and victim advocacy services. Most importantly, she should have been prepared for what to expect during the hearing and given an opportunity to request accommodations that would make the process less traumatic. Instead, Sarah and her mother arrived at the courthouse the following day with no understanding of what was about to happen, no legal representation, and no preparation for the emotional challenges they were about to face. They were directed to a small waiting room where they sat for over an hour, becoming increasingly anxious as time passed, without explanation or communication from court personnel. When Sarah finally requested permission to use the restroom, she walked directly into one of her attackers in the courthouse hallway. The girl was there with her family and attorney, apparently also waiting for the same hearing that Sarah had been called to attend. The sudden, unexpected confrontation with someone who had tried to kill her in a place where Sarah had expected to feel safe and protected created a new trauma that added to her growing distrust of the legal system. "Mom," Sarah whispered when she returned to the waiting room, "I think the hearing is today. Why else would they be here?" Acting on an instinct that would prove crucial to ensuring appropriate media coverage of the proceedings, Sarah called her friend Natalie and asked her to contact local news outlets. "If the media isn't here," Sarah told Natalie, "these girls are going to walk out of here today without any consequences. No one will know what really happened, and they'll be free to hurt someone else." This decision to seek media attention was both brave and strategically smart. Sarah understood, with wisdom beyond her years, that public accountability would be essential to ensuring that the legal system took her case seriously. Without media oversight, the juvenile proceedings could easily have resulted in minimal consequences for attackers whose crimes demanded serious punishment. When Sarah was finally called into the courtroom, she found herself facing not just the judge and court personnel, but also defense attorneys representing her attackers. One of these attorneys, representing Madison Torres, immediately demonstrated the kind of legal tactics that would characterize the defense strategy throughout the case. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "my client barely touched this alleged victim. My client is as much a victim of this situation as the person making these accusations. We have evidence that my client was coerced into participating by the other defendants, and we believe that the prosecution's case against her specifically is fundamentally flawed. This defense strategy, minimizing the attacker's culpability while simultaneously suggesting that they were victims themselves, would become a recurring theme throughout the legal proceedings. Each defense attorney attempted to portray their client as a follower rather than a leader, as someone who had been manipulated or coerced by the others, rather than as a willing participant in planned torture and attempted murder. The hearing itself was conducted with a level of informality that would have been inappropriate even for minor juvenile offenses, much less for attempted murder charges. Sarah was asked to recount her experience in front of her attackers, their families and their attorneys, without any of the protections typically afforded to victims of violent crimes. She was not offered the option of testifying via closed-circuit television, behind a screen, or in any other way that might have reduced the trauma of facing her attackers directly. Throughout her testimony, Sarah maintained remarkable composure and clarity, providing detailed accounts of the attack while looking directly at the girls who had tried to kill her. Her strength and maturity contrasted sharply with the behavior of her attackers, who smirked, whispered to their attorneys, and showed no visible signs of remorse or accountability. When Sarah finished her testimony, the judge thanked her for her time and dismissed her from the courtroom without any explanation of what would happen next in the legal process. She was not informed about sentencing proceedings, not told about her rights as a victim to provide impact statements, and not given any timeline for when the case might be resolved. "You're free to go," the court clerk told Sarah and her mother, as if they had just completed a routine administrative task rather than participating in proceedings that would determine whether Sarah's attackers faced serious consequences for their crimes. Sarah and her mother left the courthouse with no knowledge of what had been decided, what sentences had been imposed, or what protections might be in place to prevent future contact with the attackers. They learned about the outcomes of the case the same way as the general public, by watching the evening news, where reporters provided more detailed information about the proceedings than the court system had shared with the victim herself. The sentences imposed on Sarah's attackers were revealed through media coverage rather than official notification. Madison Torres and Jessica Chen were sentenced to 2 years in a juvenile rehabilitation facility, followed by probation and community service. Ashley Weber received 18 months in detention, followed by supervised release. Brittany Walsh, as the oldest participant who had been designated to carry out the actual murder, received the harshest sentence of 3 years in juvenile detention. These sentences, while substantial by juvenile justice standards, felt inadequate to Sarah and her family given the severity of the crimes and the level of premeditation involved. More troubling was the lack of meaningful rehabilitation programming or psychological intervention that might address the underlying factors that had enabled 4 teenagers to plan and attempt to carry out such extreme violence. But the most disturbing aspect of the legal proceedings was yet to come. As part of their sentences, the attackers were required to complete community service hours in Trinity Falls, the same small town where Sarah and her family were trying to rebuild their lives. This decision demonstrated a fundamental failure to understand the ongoing trauma experienced by victims of violent crime and the importance of maintaining separation between victims and their attackers. The first encounter between Sarah and one of her attackers after the sentencing occurred several months later, in the spring of 2017. Sarah was shopping at a local grocery store with her sister Emma when her mother's intuition suddenly activated with an intensity that probably saved both girls from a potentially dangerous situation. "I'm coming with you," Janet Miller announced when Sarah mentioned her plans to run a quick errand to pick up some personal care items. "Mom, I'm just going to buy some face cream," Sarah protested. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. "I'm coming with you," her mother repeated, with a firmness that brooked no argument. As they walked past the Trinity Falls Fire Department, one of Sarah's attackers emerged from the building where she was completing her community service hours. The sudden, unexpected sight of someone who had tried to murder her daughter caused Janet Miller to go into immediate shock, collapsing on the sidewalk in front of the fire station while Sarah struggled to understand what was happening. The emergency medical technicians who responded to Janet's collapse brought her inside the fire station for evaluation and treatment, creating the surreal situation of the victim's mother being treated for trauma-induced medical emergency in the same building where her daughter's attacker was serving her court-ordered community service. During this incident, Sarah was forced to call 911 to report that one of her attackers was violating the restraining order by being in close proximity to her family. The response from law enforcement was immediate and comprehensive, with multiple patrol units arriving within minutes to assess the situation and ensure Sarah's safety. "My name is Sarah Miller," she told the responding officers. "I'm the girl who was tortured in Trinity Falls last year. One of my attackers is here, and I have a protective order that's supposed to keep her away from me and my family." The officers' response demonstrated the value of the media attention that had surrounded Sarah's case. Rather than treating this as a routine complaint, they immediately recognized the significance of the situation and took comprehensive action to ensure Sarah's protection. Multiple patrol cars created a secure perimeter, while detectives were called to document the restraining order violation. Sarah was transported to the offices of the Department of Family and Children's Services, where a caseworker was supposed to be monitoring the community service compliance of juvenile offenders. What Sarah discovered there would reveal another layer of institutional failure in the handling of her case. The same girl who had just encountered her outside the fire station was also present at the DFCS office, apparently checking in for her community service assignment. The caseworker seemed unaware that Sarah and her attacker were the same people mentioned in the case files, demonstrating a level of bureaucratic disconnection that endangered the very person the system was supposed to protect. "She's doing community service," the caseworker explained to Sarah, as if this somehow justified placing an attempted murderer in close proximity to her victim. "She has to complete these hours as part of her rehabilitation. And you placed her doing community service next to my house?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You put someone who tried to kill me working in my neighborhood?" The caseworker's response revealed the fundamental disconnect between the juvenile justice system's theoretical commitment to rehabilitation and its practical failure to consider victim safety. The community service placements had been made based on convenience and availability rather than any consideration of how these assignments might affect the victims of the offender's crimes. This incident prompted Sarah's family to move once again, leaving Trinity Falls permanently in search of a place where they could live without constant fear of encountering the people who had tried to destroy their lives. But even as they relocated, the system continued to fail them in ways that demonstrated how institutions designed to protect victims can become sources of additional trauma. The most recent encounter between Sarah and her attackers had occurred just weeks before our interview, demonstrating that even years after the original attack, the aftermath continued to create new traumas and challenges. Janet Miller had been walking Emma to school following their normal morning routine when she spotted one of Sarah's attackers in the same area. The sight of someone who had participated in her daughter's torture, walking freely in the neighborhood where they were trying to build a new life, sent Janet into a panic attack that required emergency medical intervention. Once again, the Miller family found themselves dealing with the medical and emotional consequences of a system that seemed designed to prioritize the rehabilitation of offenders over the protection of victims. These repeated encounters, spanning years after the original attack, illustrated one of the most troubling aspects of Sarah's case: the failure of the juvenile justice system to recognize that some crimes create lasting trauma that requires ongoing protection and support for victims. The emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration, while important for less serious offenses, seemed inadequate for cases involving premeditated violence and attempted murder. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the gradual realization that Sarah's attackers had never truly accepted responsibility for their actions or shown genuine remorse for the pain they had caused. Their responses to the legal system had been tactical rather than authentic, designed to minimize consequences rather than demonstrate understanding of the harm they had inflicted. In interviews with social workers, psychologists, and court personnel, the attackers had provided carefully crafted responses that hit all the right notes about rehabilitation, growth, and understanding. But their behavior during chance encounters with Sarah revealed that these responses were performance rather than genuine transformation. The girl who had embraced Sarah while telling her she loved her, who had planned her murder while claiming it was for her own good, who had shown no remorse during court proceedings, this same person continued to show no genuine accountability years later when confronted with the ongoing impact of her actions on her victim's life. This disconnect between public rehabilitation narratives and private behavior patterns raised fundamental questions about the juvenile justice system's ability to address cases involving extreme violence by perpetrators who show no genuine capacity for empathy or remorse. How do you rehabilitate someone who doesn't believe they did anything wrong? How do you reintegrate into society someone who continues to pose a threat to their victims years after their original crimes? These questions would become central to understanding not just Sarah's case, but the broader challenges facing a legal system designed for typical juvenile offenses when confronted with crimes that transcend normal categories of childhood misbehavior. Sometimes the most important thing we can learn from a case is that our existing systems are inadequate to address the full spectrum of human evil, regardless of the age of the perpetrators. And sometimes, the most heroic thing a victim can do is continue to speak truth about their experience, even when institutions and individuals prefer the comfortable fiction that juvenile rehabilitation programs always work, that protective orders always protect, and that time always heals the wounds created by profound betrayal and calculated cruelty. Sarah Miller was about to discover that surviving attempted murder was only the beginning of her fight for justice, safety, and the right to live without fear in the community where her attackers walked free, claiming to be reformed while continuing to traumatize the person whose life they had tried to destroy. 7 years. 7 years had passed since that October afternoon when Sarah Miller barely escaped with her life, when 4 teenage girls had tried to bury their friend alive in a backyard grave they had dug with their own hands. 7 years of healing, of building a new life, of learning to trust again despite carrying scars that would never fully disappear. 7 years of believing that the worst was behind her, that time and distance had finally created the safety she deserved. But evil, I've learned in my decades of investigating the darkest corners of human nature, doesn't respect timelines. It doesn't recognize statute of limitations on hatred, and sometimes the people who tried to destroy you once never stop trying. They just get more sophisticated about how they do it. May 2023, Atlanta, Georgia. Sarah Miller was now 21 years old, a college student studying psychology, with plans to become a victim advocate, transforming her trauma into purpose, her survival into service for others who had endured similar horrors. She had built a life that was full and meaningful, surrounded by people who loved her, pursuing dreams that seemed impossible during those dark months following the attack. She no longer lived with her mother and sister, having moved to Atlanta for college where she could blend into the anonymity of a large city, where her past couldn't follow her with the same persistence it had in smaller communities. But Janet Miller still lived in the same area, still took Emma to the same school every morning, still followed routines that had become comfortable and predictable over the years of recovery. It was during one of these routine school drop-offs that the past reached out with claws that had grown longer and sharper with time. Janet Miller's phone call to Sarah that morning carried a tone of fear that immediately transported both women back to 2016, to a time when every shadow might hide a threat, when every unexpected encounter could mean danger. Sarah, her mother's voice was tight with controlled panic. "She's here. Madison is here." "What do you mean she's here?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would shatter the carefully constructed sense of safety they had built over 7 years of healing. "She's right here, honey. She's standing outside Emma's school. She's watching me drop off your sister." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Madison Torres, now a 22-year-old woman, had somehow tracked down her victim's family's daily routine and was actively stalking them. This wasn't a chance encounter in a grocery store or an accidental meeting at a community service location. This was deliberate, calculated surveillance of a family that had already suffered more than any family should ever have to endure. "Go to the police station, Mom," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror that was flooding her system. "Go right now. Don't go home. Don't follow your normal routine. Go directly to the police station." What followed was perhaps even more disturbing than the stalking itself. As Janet Miller attempted to distance herself from the school and make her way to safety, she realized that Madison was following her, maintaining visual contact while making no attempt to hide her surveillance activities. Even more chilling, Madison had pulled out her cell phone and was actively filming Janet Miller as she walked, creating a digital record of her stalking activities. This behavior revealed a level of psychological sophistication that was far more dangerous than the impulsive violence of 7 years earlier. Madison Torres was no longer a 14-year-old acting on sudden, cruel impulses. She was now a 22-year-old woman who had spent years thinking about Sarah Miller, planning new ways to terrorize her victim's family and developing methods of psychological warfare that were calculated to maximize fear while minimizing legal consequences. The filming was particularly sinister because it suggested that Madison intended to share or use the footage in some way. Was she creating content for social media platforms that still harbored communities obsessed with Sarah's case? Was she planning to send the footage to Sarah as a form of psychological torture? Or was she simply documenting her own power over her victims, creating trophies of her continued ability to terrify the family she had once tried to destroy completely? At the police station, Janet Miller was able to obtain an emergency protective order against Madison Torres, but the process revealed how inadequate the legal system remained when dealing with sophisticated forms of stalking and harassment. The protective order prohibited Madison from coming within 500 feet of any member of the Miller family, but it did nothing to address the underlying psychological terror of knowing that someone who had once tried to murder your daughter was actively monitoring your daily life. Detective Robert Hayes, who had taken over Sarah's case when Detective Santos retired, was professionally courteous, but clearly frustrated by the limitations of what law enforcement could do to address this new phase of victimization. "The problem we face," Detective Hayes explained to Sarah during their phone conversation, "is that technically she hasn't broken any laws yet. Standing on a public street, even near a school, isn't illegal. Filming people in public spaces isn't illegal. Following someone, as long as it doesn't rise to the level of harassment that would support criminal charges, isn't illegal. We can get protective orders, but enforcement is reactive rather than proactive." This conversation highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of Sarah's ongoing victimization, the way that legal technicalities could be exploited by someone sophisticated enough to understand the boundaries of what constituted prosecutable behavior. Madison Torres had apparently spent her years since the attack not learning empathy or developing genuine remorse, but studying how to terrorize her victims in ways that would be difficult to prosecute successfully. But perhaps more disturbing than Madison's individual behavior was what it revealed about the broader failure of the juvenile justice system to address the underlying psychological factors that had motivated the original attack. 7 years of supposed rehabilitation, counseling, and community supervision had produced not a reformed young woman who understood the gravity of her past actions, but a more sophisticated predator who had learned to hide her continued malevolence behind legal loopholes and technical compliance with court orders. This realization forced Sarah to confront questions about the nature of evil that she had been avoiding for 7 years. Could people who were capable of planning and attempting to murder a friend ever truly be rehabilitated? Did the juvenile justice system's emphasis on redemption and second chances make sense when applied to crimes that revealed such fundamental defects in human empathy and moral reasoning? As we discussed these questions during our interview, Sarah demonstrated a level of psychological insight that was remarkable for someone so young, shaped by experiences that no one should have to endure, but which had given her unique perspectives on human nature and criminal behavior. "I think the hardest thing for people to understand," Sarah explained, "is that this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of teenage stupidity that got out of hand. They planned this for days. They made lists of what they were going to do to me. They dug a grave. They recruited additional people to help them. This wasn't something they did without thinking. This was something they thought about extensively and decided to do anyway." This level of premeditation, Sarah argued, suggested psychological deficits that were unlikely to be addressed through traditional rehabilitation programs designed for typical juvenile offenders. The girls who had tortured her weren't acting out of momentary anger or peer pressure. They were acting out of something much darker and more permanent in their psychological makeup. "When someone shows you who they really are," Sarah continued, "you should believe them. They showed me who they really were when they looked me in the eyes and told me they loved me while they were planning to murder me. They showed me who they really were when they laughed during their torture session. They showed me who they really were when they had no remorse during the court proceedings. And they're showing me who they really are now, 7 years later, when they're still trying to terrorize my family." This analysis led to a broader discussion about the motivations behind the original attack, factors that had never been adequately explored during the legal proceedings, but which were crucial to understanding how 4 seemingly normal teenagers had become capable of such extreme cruelty. Looking back with the wisdom of 7 years and extensive therapy, Sarah could now identify warning signs and patterns of behavior that she had missed or minimized at the time of the attack. These insights were particularly valuable because they illustrated how subtle the early indicators of dangerous obsession could be, especially when exhibited by people who were supposed to be friends. "They were always commenting on my appearance in ways that seemed like compliments, but felt strange," Sarah recalled. "Madison would touch my hair constantly and make comments about how lucky I was to have hair that grew so thick and long. Jessica would always want to try on my clothes, but she would make weird comments about how everything looked better on me than it would on her. At the time, I thought they were just being insecure teenagers, but looking back, there was an intensity to their focus on my physical appearance that wasn't normal." The girls had also shown patterns of possessiveness and control that Sarah had initially interpreted as closeness and loyalty. They would become upset when Sarah spent time with other friends, would make subtle criticisms of Sarah's other relationships, and would often try to monopolize her time and attention in ways that gradually isolated her from other social connections. "They were very good at making me feel guilty for having other friendships," Sarah remembered. "They would act hurt if I made plans with other people, or they would find ways to schedule activities that conflicted with things I wanted to do with other friends. I thought they just really valued our friendship, but they were actually working to cut me off from other support systems." Perhaps most tellingly, both Madison and Jessica had shown unusual interest in Sarah's family life and personal circumstances, asking detailed questions about her parents' work schedules, her sister's therapy appointments, and the family's daily routines. At the time, Sarah had interpreted this as genuine care and interest in her life, but in retrospect it was clear that they were gathering intelligence that would later be used to plan their attack. They knew exactly when my mum would be at work, exactly when Emma would be at therapy, exactly when I would be alone, Sarah realized. They had been studying my family's schedule for months, learning our vulnerabilities and planning how to exploit them. That level of calculation isn't something that happens overnight. They had been thinking about hurting me for a long time before they actually did it. These insights highlighted the sophisticated nature of predatory behavior, even when exhibited by young people who might not fully understand their own motivations. The girls who had attacked Sarah hadn't simply snapped one day. They had engaged in an extended process of psychological preparation that involved manipulation, isolation, and intelligence gathering that resembled the behavior patterns of adult predators. But the most important question remained: why had they chosen Sarah as their target? What had motivated four girls to focus their collective malevolence on someone who had considered them her closest friends? After years of therapy and reflection, Sarah had come to understand that the attack had been fundamentally motivated by envy, a psychological force that is particularly toxic during adolescence, when identity formation and social comparison create intense competition and resentment among peers. "I think they hated me because I had things they wanted," Sarah explained, with a directness that comes from years of painful self-examination. Not material things necessarily, but family stability, parental attention, social confidence, academic success. I wasn't trying to make them feel bad about their circumstances, but my existence reminded them of what they didn't have, and they couldn't handle that reminder. This analysis was supported by comments the attackers had made during the torture session, many of which had focused on Sarah's perceived advantages and privileges. They had accused her of not appreciating her good life, of taking for granted the love and support that they felt was lacking in their own circumstances. In their twisted logic, destroying Sarah would somehow remedy the unfairness they perceived in their respective situations. "They told me I didn't appreciate what I had," Sarah recalled. "They said they were teaching me to value my life by threatening to take it away. But what they were really doing was punishing me for having things they wanted but couldn't have themselves." This psychological dynamic, the transformation of envy into violence, represents one of the most dangerous combinations in human behavior, particularly when it occurs during adolescence. Young people who feel fundamentally disadvantaged compared to their peers can develop obsessive resentments that, under certain circumstances, can evolve into homicidal rage. The case reminded me of other incidents I had investigated over the years, situations where individuals had become so consumed with jealousy toward people in their social circles that they had committed acts of extreme violence. These crimes often seemed incomprehensible to outsiders because the victims were typically well-liked, successful individuals who had done nothing to provoke such extreme retaliation. But that was precisely the point. They were targeted not despite their positive qualities, but because of them. Their success, happiness, and social advantages had become unbearable reminders to their attackers of their own perceived inadequacies and failures. Sarah's case was particularly disturbing because it involved not just individual envy, but group psychology that had amplified and focused that envy into a collective obsession with destroying their target. Madison, Jessica, Ashley, and Brittany had found each other, recognized their shared resentment towards Sarah, and formed a conspiracy that enabled each of them to act on impulses that they might not have pursued individually. "I think they fed off each other's anger," Sarah observed. "Alone, maybe one of them might have had nasty thoughts about me, but wouldn't have acted on them. But together, they created this echo chamber where their worst impulses were validated and encouraged, until they reached a point where murder seemed like a reasonable solution to their jealousy." This group dynamic element of the crime made it particularly relevant to understanding other cases of collaborative violence among young people. When individuals with similar psychological vulnerabilities find each other and form alliances based on shared resentments, they can enable each other to commit acts that exceed anything they would have contemplated individually. During our conversation, Sarah mentioned several other cases that had similarities to her own experience, including recent incidents that had received national media attention. These cases shared common elements: groups of young people targeting someone in their social circle, extensive premeditation and planning, and motivations rooted in jealousy and social competition rather than traditional criminal incentives. "There was a case recently involving an actor named Jefferson Machado," Sarah mentioned. "The details were different, but the basic pattern was the same: friends who became killers because they couldn't handle someone else's success. The difference is that he wasn't able to escape the way I was." These parallel cases suggested that Sarah's experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of juvenile violence that was driven by social media amplified competition, decreased empathy among young people, and a culture that increasingly viewed extreme violence as an acceptable response to personal grievances. The fact that similar crimes continued to occur years after Sarah's case received national attention suggested that the lessons of her experience hadn't been adequately absorbed by society, educational institutions, or criminal justice systems. Young people were still forming murder conspiracies against their peers, still recording their crimes for social media distribution, still showing minimal remorse when caught and prosecuted. This pattern of repeated similar crimes raised fundamental questions about whether society was adequately addressing the underlying psychological and social factors that enabled such extreme juvenile violence. Were schools teaching adequate empathy and conflict resolution skills? Were parents monitoring their children's social media consumption and peer relationships? Were mental health professionals equipped to identify and intervene with young people who showed early signs of dangerous obsession with their peers? But rather than becoming consumed with despair about these broader social failures, Sarah had chosen to focus her energy on healing, growth, and service to others who had experienced similar traumas. Her decision to study psychology and pursue a career in victim advocacy represented a remarkable transformation of her traumatic experience into purpose and meaning. I decided that if I survived something this terrible, I had an obligation to use that survival to help other people, Sarah explained. I can't undo what happened to me, but I can use my experience to help other victims navigate the legal system, find appropriate therapy, and rebuild their lives after trauma. This decision to channel her survival into service represented a level of psychological resilience that was extraordinary, even by the standards of trauma recovery. Rather than allowing her victimization to define her life in negative ways, Sarah had found ways to transform it into a source of strength and purpose. The hardest part wasn't the physical recovery, she reflected. The hardest part was learning to trust people again, learning to believe that friendship could be genuine rather than manipulative, learning to recognize the difference between people who cared about me and people who might want to hurt me. This process of rebuilding trust had required extensive therapy, careful selection of new relationships, and a gradual expansion of her social circle as she developed better instincts for identifying trustworthy people. It had also required accepting that some level of wariness and vigilance would always be part of her psychological landscape. I learned to listen to my instincts in ways I never had before, Sarah said. If something feels off about someone, if their behavior doesn't match their words, if they seem too interested in details about my life, I pay attention to those feelings now instead of dismissing them as paranoia. These hard-won insights had made Sarah particularly effective in her victim advocacy work, where her personal experience with trauma and recovery provided her with credibility and understanding that couldn't be learned from textbooks or professional training alone. When I tell other victims that they can survive this, that they can rebuild their lives, that they can find happiness again, they believe me because they know I've been where they are, Sarah explained. I can speak to the reality of trauma recovery in ways that people who haven't experienced it themselves simply can't. But perhaps most remarkably, Sarah's experience had not made her cynical about human nature or pessimistic about the possibility of genuine friendship and love. Despite having her trust betrayed in the most extreme way possible, she had found ways to remain open to new relationships and new experiences. I refuse to let what they did to me prevent me from living a full life, she declared, with a strength that was clearly hard-won through years of difficult work. If I become isolated and suspicious and unable to trust anyone, then they win. They don't get to destroy my future just because they tried to destroy my past. This attitude represented perhaps the most profound victory over her attackers that Sarah could have achieved. By choosing healing over hatred, growth over grievance, and service over self-pity, she had demonstrated that the human spirit could survive even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. As our interview drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on what Sarah's case revealed about the nature of evil, the possibility of justice, and the resilience of victims who refuse to be defined by their victimization. Her story was simultaneously one of the most disturbing cases I had ever investigated, and one of the most inspiring examples of recovery I had ever witnessed. The evil that had been directed towards Sarah was real and profound, demonstrating that human cruelty could exceed even experienced investigators' understanding of what people were capable of doing to each other. The systematic nature of the planning, the casual enjoyment of inflicting pain, and the complete absence of empathy or remorse had challenged my fundamental assumptions about human nature. But Sarah's response to that evil, her survival, her recovery, her transformation of trauma into purpose, had been equally profound in demonstrating the human capacity for healing, growth, and transcendence. She had proven that even the most calculated attempts to destroy someone's life could be overcome through courage, support, and an unwillingness to surrender to victimhood. "I want people to know," Sarah said as we prepared to end our conversation, "that survival is possible. Recovery is possible. Building a life that's full of meaning and happiness after trauma is possible. It's not easy, and it takes time, but it can be done." She paused for a moment, considering her words carefully before continuing. "I also want people to understand that the kind of evil I experienced is real, and it can come from people you trust completely. We need to teach young people to recognize warning signs, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, and to understand that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who want to hurt you most." These dual messages, hope for victims and warning for potential future victims, seem to capture the essential lessons of Sarah's case. Evil exists often in forms and from sources that we don't expect, but so does the human capacity to survive, heal, and find meaning after even the most extreme trauma. As I watched Sarah leave our interview, confident and purposeful despite carrying scars that would never fully fade, I was reminded why I had chosen to dedicate my career to investigating violent crime. It wasn't just about catching perpetrators or solving cases. It was about bearing witness to the full spectrum of human experience, from the darkest depths of cruelty to the highest peaks of resilience and recovery. Sarah Miller's case would remain with me long after the files were closed, not just because of the horror of what had been done to her, but because of the grace and strength with which she had responded to that horror. She had survived an attempt to bury her alive, and she had used that survival to build a life that was more meaningful than her attackers could ever comprehend. In a world where evil often seems to triumph and victims are too often forgotten, Sarah Miller's story stood as a testament to the possibility of justice, healing, and hope. She had refused to let her attackers have the final word in her story, and in doing so, she had achieved the most complete victory possible over those who had tried to destroy her. The 4 girls who had planned her murder were now women in their 20s, still showing no genuine remorse, still trying to terrorize the family they had failed to destroy 7 years earlier. But Sarah Miller was also a woman in her 20s now, using her education, her experience, and her survival to make the world a safer place for other victims of violence. In the end, that seemed like the most appropriate conclusion to a case that had begun with calculated evil and ended with chosen goodness. Sometimes the most important victory isn't preventing crime or achieving perfect justice. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let evil have the last word in the story of your life. And sometimes the greatest gift a survivor can give to the world is proof that survival is possible, that healing can happen, and that even in the darkest moments, hope remains stronger than hatred, love remains stronger than cruelty, and life remains stronger than those who try to destroy it. Sarah Miller had provided that proof through her survival, her recovery, and her commitment to helping others find their own paths from victimhood to victory. Her story would continue long after our interview ended, not as a tale of teenage violence, but as an example of human resilience that would inspire other victims to believe that they too could survive, recover, and build lives of meaning and purpose. That belief, that survival and healing were possible even after the worst that humans could do to each other, seemed like the most important truth to emerge from a case that had revealed so many disturbing realities about human nature. In choosing to share her story, Sarah Miller had given that gift of hope to countless others who would face their own dark moments and need to believe that morning would come again. Her attackers had tried to bury her alive, but Sarah Miller had risen from that grave to build a life that was more beautiful and meaningful than anything they could have imagined. In the end, that was the victory that mattered most.